Go ahead.
Our next talk has two co-authors. Paolo DiLazzaro from Italy, co-authored this paper with Diana Fulbright, is not here. Diana will be reading the paper. Diana is Director of Research at the Richmond, Virginia Shroud of Turin Center since its inception in 1997. She's been researching the Shroud since 1980. She formerly taught the history of Christianity and related languages at the University of Iowa and Biblical Studies in Hebrew at the Benedictine Abbey in Richmond. She currently serves on the board of directors of STERA, Barry's organization, and also of the National Shrine of the Holy Shroud, Inc. Diana Fulbright.
All right, testing, 1, 2, 3. Are we okay? Too loud? All right. Paolo and I wrote this paper together, and obviously we each brought something different to it. He's a scientist, and I'm obviously not. And I just want to say that faith in science, which we can also call belief in reason, as we know, frequently converge in studies on the Shroud. But not only religious faith, but also an unswerving belief in a particular idea may become a preconceived conclusion that ultimately precludes reason. And a kind of an example of that, is that better? Should I hold this thing? All right. Is that good? All right. An example might be Joe Nickell, who his skeptical rejection of any and all scientific evidence for the authenticity of the Turin Shroud exemplifies such a triumphal faith or belief over science and reason. Likewise, some of our researchers seem to find scientific or historical evidence where it does not actually exist. Their conclusion comes first, and then there's a search for evidence. So in this paper, we are examining the suggestion that a strong earthquake in first century Jerusalem could have been instrumental in formation of the image on the Shroud of Turin. This idea rests scientifically on an hypothesis proposing a piezonuclear fission reaction of atmospheric neutrons on linen, and historically on the earthquakes described in the crucifixion and resurrection pericopes of the Gospel of Matthew. According to the hypothesis of piezonuclear fission reaction, when various kinds of rock are crushed, very high emissions of neutrons are observed, 10 times the background level in the case of granite and 100 times in the case of basalt, and of course there are other rocks. These conclusions are interpreted as the result of splitting or fission of iron atoms in the rock into lighter atoms such as those of aluminum. Unlike the materials used in conventional fission reactions, the crushed rock does not, researchers maintain, emit ionizing gamma rays or leave behind radioactive waste. Some researchers have acknowledged that established nuclear physics shows that even the very high compression as proposed could not supply the enormous amounts of energy needed to split nuclei, but maintain that the classical theory of fission still has a few holes in it, as one author has been quoted. How did the Piezonuclear fission reaction come to be associated with the Shroud? Jean-Baptiste Renaudot, in a paper presented in the 1998 Turin Congress, suggested that this sort of fission reaction might account for the skewed radiocarbon dating of 1988. According to Renaudot, additional carbon-14 atoms would have been formed by means of a hypothetical high flux of neutrons interacting with nitrogen in the atmosphere to produce additional isotopes of carbon-14. These additional isotopes would have been captured by the cellulose of the linen cloth, leading to an apparently younger age of the linen, as was determined by the radiocarbon dating. Then, just a few years ago, some researchers in Italy introduced the idea that a piezonuclear fission reaction was involved in formation of the image. According to their hypothesis, the image would have been formed by a flux of thermal neutrons directed into the cloth through cavitation, resulting in a superficial coloration reflecting the body of the man wrapped in the cloth. Cavitation refers to high-intensity sound waves that would be produced by an earthquake of approximately 9 on the Richter scale. Now, whether or not a piezonuclear fission reaction could possibly have caused the formation of the image, the hypothesis itself has been widely disputed. And we also question whether or not a devastating earthquake of very high magnitude, 8 to 9 magnitude, could have taken place in first century Jerusalem when there is no reference to such an event in any contemporary writer. The claim that a strong earthquake historically attested took place in the city of Jerusalem originates solely from the Gospel of Matthew, as no other reference to an earthquake in Jerusalem at that time is found among contemporary writers. Although scholars have not been able to determine with certainty the year of Christ's death, and no date is mentioned obviously in the Gospel, the year assigned to this destruction is 33 AD, and this, in all the papers written about this, it's very firm, it's not approximately 33 AD. And 3 references have been offered as substantiating the historicity of the Matthean earthquakes. These include, number 1, comments mistakenly attributed to an obscure historian by the name of Thalos. Second, a brief reference to an earthquake in the narrative of Joseph of Arimathea, which is a medieval legend. And third, Dante's allegorical epic poem, The Divine Comedy, which was written in the 14th century. So we'll just take these one by one. Who was Thalos? We know of an historian by that name, Thalos, whose histories covered the events of the Mediterranean world from the fall of Troy to the 167th Olympiad. Now that the Olympiad was 112 to 109 BC. So obviously, this Thalos didn't write about the crucifixion. Anyway, this history wouldn't have included anything like that. However, a gentleman named Julius Sextus Africanus, writing a paraphrase of Matthew's account of the Passion, remarked that some Thalos, had been mistaken in attributing darkness at the time of the crucifixion to a solar eclipse. Now, Africanus's work, who wrote in the early 3rd century, has been lost, but some of his writings, including this reference to Thalos, was preserved by the 9th century chronologer George Syncellus. So obviously he was talking about some other Thalos, not the famous or semi-famous historian. So all we know of this Thalos is that he wrote no later than the early part of the 3rd century, so it's relatively early, and that he needed a refresher course in astronomy, because you can only have a lunar eclipse at the time of Passover, and you wouldn't be able to see this at midday. Midday, sorry, thank you. But there is no evidence that either Thalos or Africanus or Syncellus used any source other than the gospel account, and they just don't say anything about destruction, devastation, anything like that. The narrative of Joseph of Arimathea, a legendary melange expanding on biblical and apocryphal passages related to the Passion story, really cannot be said to attest independently to the historicity of the earthquake. The earliest manuscript of this work dates from the 12th century, and the opinion of people who have studied it is that the narrative does not appear to have been written early in our Christian tradition, but it could be something like 4th or 5th century up to the 12th century, the date of the earliest manuscript. There is no reason in the text to consider this an independent source, not dependent on Matthew. I'm sorry I don't have my slides. They kind of disappeared in my computer, and I was just going to give you the text. It just refers to an obscure earthquake at the time of the crucifixion. Now we have a very peculiar passage in Dante's Inferno regarding shattering of the sixth arch 1266 years before him, and appears to allude to the crucifixion earthquake. And I'm not going to read you all of this. Yesterday, later by 5 hours than now, 1203 score years and 6 had filled the circuit of their course, since here the way was broken. That's it. Now, how can this be said to be attesting to a devastating earthquake of magnitude 9 in exactly 33 AD? It really cannot be said to do that, but people claim that it has. So those are the so-called independent sources supporting Matthew, whereas it's pretty obvious that Matthew was their sole source. Now, to change course here, an article by the noted seismologist Nicholas Abramses in the 2005 Journal of Seismology, entitled Historical Earthquakes in Jerusalem, a Methodological Discussion, is erroneously cited in support of the scriptural earthquake as an actual event. Abramses was emeritus professor of engineering seismology, and for many years at Imperial College London. And for many years he was considered the leading figure in absolute authority in earthquake engineering and seismology throughout Europe. And the Professor Abramses passed away just a couple of years ago, by the way. So this statement is attributed to the statement that we find in the literature is, Abramses' observation would give further scientific value as well as historical and archaeological importance to the hypothesis that in Old Jerusalem there was a strong earthquake very close to the 9th degree in the Richter scale. It goes on, considering the historical sources, of which we've seen there are none, attesting the occurrence of a disastrous earthquake in 33 AD, and assuming a hypothetical magnitude between the 8th and 9th degree in the Richter scale, citing again Abramses, it is possible to provide an evaluation of the consequent neutron flux. But Abramses, if you look at what he wrote, he dismisses the earthquakes in Matthew as unhistorical, refutes any possibility of a Jerusalem earthquake of a magnitude between the 8th and 9th degree, contrary to the researcher's claim. Abramses concludes the earthquake at the crucifixion is a spurious event. Now, we may not agree entirely with his statement. There may have been an earthquake, but it would have been very small. Nevertheless, this professor can, I would say he's the last person who should be cited to give further scientific value to this idea. Now we turn to the significant earthquake database of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. This is cited also erroneously for scientific data of the historical earthquake of 33 AD in Jerusalem. On this database, we find this note. They list earthquakes from several thousand years before Christ right up to today. The source for this information, where an earthquake is listed in 33, I think level 2, I don't know, is the Gospel according to Matthew, to St. Matthew. These earthquakes are mentioned only by one evangelist and by chroniclers who use Matthew as their sole source, and hence must not be considered to refer to historical earthquakes. Now, why would anyone go to so much trouble for an earthquake? Because this hypothesis requires, according to the researcher's own estimate, a very high magnitude earthquake, as high as 9 on the Richter scale, which should have razed Jerusalem to the ground, and we have no evidence. This earthquake with its attendant destruction is not mentioned by any contemporary source, including Philo, Pliny, Josephus, the Apostle Paul, and is likewise absent from the other Gospels. Finally, I'd like to say that the premise that the earthquakes of Matthew may somehow be involved in image formation is completely untenable. Somebody will say why it's not, but on the basis of the Gospel text, the earthquake coinciding with Christ's death cannot be relevant because the body was on the cross, not yet wrapped in the linen shroud. So how is this earthquake causing image formation? The second earthquake, and both of them, you know, have kind of supernatural events. The first earthquake, people got up out of their graves and walked through the city and all that sort of thing, long dead. The second earthquake, according to the evangelists, occurred as the women approached the sepulchre when Jesus had risen and the burial cloths are left behind. So both Matthean earthquakes are depicted as occurring when the shroud was not in contact with the body, and I don't see how they could have had any role in formation of the image. So that part of the hypothesis is out. The piezonuclear fission theory itself is widely disputed. Critical papers have been published in respected scientific journals refuting the idea as unscientific. And funding for the underlying research was recently withdrawn by the Italian government after protests and pressure from more than 1,000 Italian and international scientists who maintain that the experiments are badly described and no other groups have been able to reproduce them so far. This piezonuclear fission reaction hypothesizes the production of a proton in the radiocarbon formation chain in the atmosphere. This involves the hypothetical high flux of neutrons directed into the cloth, which are said to generate protons which interact with the linen cellulose to give a superficial coloration. In fact, neutrons intrinsically do not interact with any chemical bonds. Only the use of a suitable conversion screen, only the use of a suitable conversion screen may be impressed by a neutron flux, and it's only the alleged secondary protons which would interact with linen to generate oxidation of cellulose. But the cellulose does not contain the special materials which may interact with neutrons. Moreover, in Rinaldo's hypothesis, the alleged source of neutrons and protons was the body of the man of the shroud. It was energy from the body that impressed the very superficial image on the shroud surface, that part of the surface that was in contact with the body. On the contrary, in this hypothesis, the source of neutrons is not the body, but the rocks on the walls of the tomb. Therefore, the flux of neutrons and the secondary protons is directed to the outside surface of the linen cloth. As a consequence, the image said to be created by this fission reaction would be on the outside of the cloth. This is in contradiction to what is clearly visible to the naked eye and to the detailed results of STIRP studies. It has been claimed that an earthquake of the 9th degree in the Richter scale could provide a thermal neutron flux ranging around 10 to the 10th power per centimeter squared per second. Paolo has outlined some problems with this claim, as well as with the hypothesis of piezonuclear fission reaction. The first problem, such a huge neutron flux can be found only in the core of a nuclear reactor with enriched uranium. That's what Paolo says. So belatedly realizing that a factor of 100 billion or 10 billion would have killed every living organism around, the researchers revised the neutron flux estimation from this original 10 to the 10th power per centimeter squared per second to a modest 1,000 times the natural neutron background. The second problem, cross-section and percentage of nitrogen in the linen are not sufficient to generate a significant secondary electronic emission, because a flux of neutrons would interact with nuclei and could not modify chemical bonds or electronic arrangements. As a consequence, neutrons cannot discolor a linen cloth. Linen cannot work as a neutron imaging plate, as hypothesized. Third problem, even if it were possible that linen could image the neutron flux coming from the tomb's walls, the resulting coloration, as we said, would be on the external surface of the linen, which covered the body. In addition, the coloration, according to Paolo, would be shapeless. This is in contradiction to the presence of the image on the front and the back, and with clear evidence that the images are on the side of the linen, which is in contact with the body. The fourth problem, if neutron radiation from a local strong earthquake had an effect, it should have made every object around much richer of C14. But we can find no anomalous radiocarbon dates in the Judean region, which might have been affected by neutron irradiation. Fifth and most basic problem, according to the researchers, the alleged neutron emission starts from earthquake-induced piezonuclear fission reactions. The question is, do piezonuclear reactions really exist? In an important article in Physics Letters, a number of researchers concluded that they do not. And as I mentioned earlier, funding for this research has been withdrawn because of that. To summarize, we, that is to say Paolo, who wrote this section, has shown that the claim of accelerated and gamma-less transformation of thorium due to cavitation is not substantiated by the experimental evidence presented. We have also shown that the experimental procedures and the treatment of data are below the standards normally accepted by the physics community. Furthermore, we have discovered serious errors and shortcomings in the presented data. Under these circumstances, we must conclude that the claim made should be considered mere speculation. This is bad science, it is bad exegesis, it is bad use of sources, and it's best we might call it wishful thinking, but in fact it represents false statements, false citations, and falsification of data. Paolo also added this: the story about a mythical earthquake and mythical science about mythical neutron radiation from earthquakes producing an image on linen and affecting the radiocarbon dating may ultimately bring discredit to the credibility of valid scientific Shroud studies. That's all we have to say.